The mahogany conference table gleamed under fluorescent lights as 37 family members filed into the law office that Tuesday afternoon. Champagne glasses clinked against silver trays, while my stepmother adjusted her pearls for the third time in 10 minutes. My half-brother Marcus smoothed his silk tie and whispered something to his wife that made her giggle behind manicured fingers. The air buzzed with expectation, thick as summer humidity before a thunderstorm. I sat in the back corner, hands folded in my lap, watching the performance unfold. Nobody looked my way. Why would they? For 28 years, I'd been the shadow in family photos, the afterthought at holiday dinners, the daughter who learned early that silence was safer than hoping for attention that never came. Dad commanded the room from his seat beside the attorney, silver hair perfectly styled, shoulders squared with the confidence of a man who'd spent decades making decisions for everyone else. His voice carried that familiar authority as he gestured toward Marcus. "Today marks the beginning of a new chapter for the Morrison legacy," he announced, beaming with pride. "My son will carry on what 3 generations built." Applause rippled through the room. Aunts dabbed their eyes with linen handkerchiefs. Cousins raised their glasses in toast. The attorney, Mr. Pemberton, shuffled through documents with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd presided over countless family transfers. His briefcase sat open beside him, leather worn smooth from decades of similar gatherings. What none of them knew was that I'd spent the last 6 months preparing for this exact moment. While they planned their celebration, I'd been building something else entirely. Something that would change everything they thought they understood about power, family, and who really controlled the Morrison fortune. But before I tell you exactly what my father didn't know, before I show you how one quiet woman with a manila folder could turn an entire legacy upside down, let me take you back. Because stories like this don't begin at will readings. They start years earlier, in moments nobody remembers, except the person who lived them. Growing up in the Morrison household was like living inside a carefully choreographed play where everyone knew their lines except me. Dad owned a chain of luxury hotels across the Southwest, properties that generated millions in revenue each year. The family name appeared on bronze plaques in marble lobbies, on charitable foundation letterheads, in business magazines that featured him as a visionary leader. Marcus had been groomed for succession since childhood. Private schools, business internships, a corner office at Morrison Hotels by age 25. Every board meeting included him. Every major decision ran through him first. Dad spoke about him with the kind of reverence usually reserved for saints or war heroes. "That boy has vision," he'd say, eyes gleaming with paternal pride. "He understands what it takes to build an empire." Meanwhile, I learned to navigate around the edges of their world. My achievements earned polite nods, if they earned anything at all. When I graduated summa cum laude with a finance degree, Dad attended the ceremony, but spent most of it checking his phone. When I earned my CPA license, the celebration dinner lasted exactly 43 minutes before conversation shifted to Marcus's latest hotel acquisition. The pattern became clear early. I was the spare daughter, the insurance policy nobody planned to use. Useful for family photos and charity events, but never essential to the real business of being a Morrison. So I stopped trying to prove my worth to people who'd already decided I didn't have any. Instead, I built my own path. I took a position with a forensic accounting firm downtown, specializing in financial investigations. My job involved examining corporate records, tracing money flows, and uncovering discrepancies that others missed. I learned to read between the lines of balance sheets, to spot irregularities hidden in routine transactions, to follow paper trails that led to uncomfortable truths. The skills I developed weren't glamorous, but they were precise, methodical, thorough. While Marcus charmed investors at cocktail parties, I sat in windowless rooms analyzing spreadsheets. While he gave interviews about the future of hospitality, I studied the fine print of contracts and compliance reports. My work kept me busy enough that I rarely attended family gatherings. Dad never seemed to notice my absence, but Grandmother Morrison did. She was the only person who ever really saw me, the only one who asked questions about my career and listened to the answers. During our monthly lunches at her country club, she'd lean forward with genuine interest as I described complex financial investigations. "You have a gift for seeing what others miss," she told me once, stirring honey into her tea. "That's rarer than people realize." I thought she meant my analytical skills. I didn't understand until much later that she was talking about something bigger, something that would matter more than any hotel chain or family legacy. 3 years ago, Grandmother Morrison asked me to review some paperwork for her. Nothing dramatic, just routine financial documents that seemed confusing. I expected to spend an afternoon organizing bank statements and investment summaries. What I found instead changed everything. The Morrison Family Trust, established decades earlier to protect the hotel properties, had been systematically drained. Millions of dollars had been transferred out through a series of complex transactions, all authorized by signatures I recognized. Emergency repairs that never happened. Consulting fees paid to companies that existed only on paper. Investment opportunities that somehow evaporated without trace. The pattern was sophisticated, carefully disguised across multiple accounts and subsidiaries. Someone with intimate knowledge of the trust structure had been bleeding it dry for years. Someone who understood exactly how to move money without triggering automatic oversight. Someone who had legitimate access to the accounts. My hands trembled as I traced each transaction back to its source. The signatures were authentic. The authorizations were properly documented. Everything appeared legal and above board, which made it even more devastating. This wasn't amateur theft. This was systematic embezzlement by someone the family trusted completely. When I showed Grandmother Morrison what I'd discovered, her face went pale as winter sky. She studied each document with the careful attention of someone who'd built her own fortune through decades of shrewd investments. Finally, she looked up with eyes that held more sadness than surprise. "I suspected something was wrong," she said quietly. "The returns weren't adding up, but I never imagined the scope." We sat in her sunroom that afternoon, surrounded by the antique furniture and family photographs that represented 93 years of accumulated memories. She asked me what I thought we should do. I told her the truth. If we reported the theft, it would destroy the family. If we ignored it, there might be nothing left to inherit. "There's a third option," she said, reaching for a leather portfolio I'd never seen before. "Something I've been considering for quite some time. Inside were documents that would change everything, a new trust structure, completely separate from the compromised accounts, transfer papers for the most valuable properties, a revised will that reflected what she'd learned about loyalty, competence, and who could actually be trusted with the family legacy. "I've been watching you for years," she explained. "The way you handle responsibility, the way you see truth even when it's uncomfortable, the way you never ask for credit when you solve problems." She'd already consulted with attorneys, tax specialists, and financial advisors. Everything was legal, properly structured, and designed to protect what remained of the Morrison fortune from further damage. All she needed was my agreement to serve as successor trustee and primary beneficiary. I stared at the documents, understanding immediately what they meant. This wasn't just inheritance, this was revolution. A complete inversion of everything my family believed about power, succession, and who deserved to control their legacy. "Why me?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "Because you're the only one who hasn't tried to steal from me," she replied with the dry humor that had sustained her through 9 decades of family drama. "And because you're the only one with the skills to protect what I've built." We spent the next 6 months quietly implementing her plan. Properties were transferred to the new trust. Investment accounts were moved to institutions that Marcus had never heard of. Legal documents were filed with courts in jurisdictions he'd never think to check. By the time Grandmother Morrison passed away 8 months ago, the original trust contained nothing but worthless shell companies and depleted accounts. The real assets, The properties that actually generated income, the investments that actually held value, all of it belonged to a structure that existed completely outside the family's awareness. Dad never bothered to examine the legal documents. Marcus never questioned the monthly statements that showed steady returns. They were so confident in their control, so certain that inheritance followed predictable patterns, that they never looked beneath the surface. Which brings us back to that Tuesday afternoon in the law office, with 37 family members raising champagne glasses to celebrate Marcus's ascension to power. As Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat to begin reading the will, I reached into my purse and withdrew a manila folder. Inside were copies of every document, every transfer, every legal filing that had quietly transformed the Morrison legacy over the past 3 years. Dad's voice rang out across the conference room one final time. All Morrison Hotel properties, all investment accounts, all business assets transfer to my son Marcus. She gets nothing. The room erupted in cheers. Marcus stood to accept congratulations while his wife beamed beside him. Even Mr. Pemberton smiled, clearly pleased to preside over such a harmonious family transition. That was when I stood up, folder in hand, and spoke the words that would shatter their celebration into pieces. "Mr. Pemberton," I said, voice calm as morning coffee, "you really don't know what you're reading, do you?" The silence that followed could have choked a grown man. Every champagne glass froze halfway to waiting lips. Every smile melted like ice cream in August heat. Mr. Pemberton's reading glasses slipped down his nose as he stared at me with the expression of someone who'd just watched their entire world tilt sideways. "I beg your pardon," he stammered, adjusting his tie with fingers that suddenly seemed unsteady. I opened the manila folder with deliberate precision, each movement calculated to draw every eye in the room. The papers inside rustled like autumn leaves, the only sound in a conference room that had gone graveyard quiet. Dad's face shifted from confusion to irritation, the way it always did when someone interrupted his carefully orchestrated plans. "What's she talking about?" Marcus demanded, his voice carrying that familiar edge of entitlement. "What papers are those?" I pulled out the first document, holding it high enough that the letterhead caught the overhead lights. Morrison Family Trust, amended and restated. The date stamp showed it was barely 3 months old, filed just weeks after Grandmother Morrison's funeral. "This," I said, setting it gently on the polished conference table, "is the actual trust document that governs the Morrison assets." Mr. Pemberton reached for his briefcase with movements that had lost their earlier confidence. He fumbled through his own papers, checking dates, scanning signatures, his face growing paler with each passing second. The document he'd been reading from suddenly looked thin, inadequate, like a prop from a play nobody had told him was ending. Dad stood so abruptly his chair rolled backward into the wall. "That's impossible. I reviewed every document myself. I signed every transfer. I controlled every decision." "You controlled the original trust," I replied, my voice steady as bedrock. "The one that Grandmother Morrison established 40 years ago. The one that you've been systematically emptying for the past decade." The words landed like physical blows. Aunt Catherine dropped her champagne flute, the crystal shattering against marble floor with a sound sharp enough to make everyone flinch. Uncle Robert's face went the color of old parchment. Marcus stumbled backward as if I'd slapped him across the mouth. "That's a lie," Dad snarled, but his voice cracked on the last word. "I never touched trust funds. Every transaction was legitimate business expense." I pulled out the second document, then the third, spreading them across the table like cards in a winning hand. Bank transfer records, vendor payments to companies that existed only as post office boxes, consulting fees paid to shell corporations registered in states where Marcus happened to own vacation homes. "Legitimate business expenses," I repeated, running my finger down a column of numbers. Like the $800,000 paid to Desert Sun Consulting for hotel renovations that never happened, or the $500,000 transferred to Southwest Hospitality Solutions, which turns out to be registered at the same address as Marcus's beach house in Malibu. The room erupted in whispers, family members leaning toward each other with shocked expressions and pointing fingers. Cousin Jennifer covered her mouth with both hands. Uncle William started calculating numbers on his phone, his face growing darker with each tap of his fingers. Mr. Pemberton finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. These documents appear to be authentic. The notary seals are genuine. The filing dates predate Mrs. Morrison's death by several months. Of course they're authentic, I said, pulling out a thick folder bound with legal ribbon. Grandmother Morrison spent 2 years working with a team of attorneys to establish this new trust structure. She wanted to protect the family assets from further mismanagement. Dad's face had gone from pale to red to a shade of purple that probably required medical attention. His hands shook as he reached for the documents, scanning the first page with eyes that darted back and forth like a trapped animal looking for escape routes. She was 93 years old, he said, his voice rising toward desperation. She wasn't mentally competent. This is elder abuse. This is fraud. Actually, said a new voice from the back of the room, she was sharper than most people half her age. Every head turned toward the conference room door, where Dr. Elizabeth Warren stood in her pristine white coat, medical bag in one hand, legal folder in the other. She was Grandmother Morrison's physician for the last 15 years, a woman whose reputation for thorough documentation was legendary in medical circles. "Dr. Warren," I said, standing to acknowledge her entrance. "Thank you for coming." She walked to the front of the room with the confident stride of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news to grieving families. "I've reviewed Mrs. Morrison's medical records from the past 5 years. Her cognitive function tests were consistently normal. Her decision-making capacity was never questioned. In fact, she specifically requested mental competency evaluations before finalizing any major financial decisions. The folder she carried contained psychological assessments, neurological test results, and signed statements from 3 independent doctors confirming that Grandmother Morrison possessed full mental capacity right up until her final days. Each document was dated, notarized, and witnessed by medical professionals who had no connection to the family finances. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "This isn't possible. The hotels, the properties, the investment accounts, they're all in the original trust. I've been managing them for years." "You've been managing empty shell companies for years," I corrected, pulling out a property deed that bore my signature as the new owner. "The actual assets were quietly transferred to the Morrison Legacy Trust 18 months ago. The hotels still operate under the original names, but they're owned by a completely different legal entity." I spread the property deeds across the table like a royal flush in a high-stakes poker game. The Scottsdale Resort and Spa, the Phoenix Convention Center Hotel, the Tucson Mountain Lodge, the Flagstaff Historic Inn. Each deed showed the same pattern: transferred from the original Morrison Family Trust to the Morrison Legacy Trust, with me listed as primary beneficiary and trustee. Grandmother Morrison didn't just suspect financial impropriety, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each revelation. She hired forensic accountants to document it. She consulted with federal investigators about potential charges. She spent months gathering evidence that would have sent people to prison. The manila folder seemed bottomless, producing document after document that painted a picture of systematic theft spanning nearly a decade. Wire transfer records showing money flowing from trust accounts to personal bank accounts. Invoices for work that was never performed. Vendor payments to companies that Marcus secretly owned through a web of shell corporations. Dad slumped into his chair, all the fight draining out of him like air from a punctured balloon. The man who'd commanded boardrooms and intimidated competitors looked suddenly ancient, diminished, defeated. His empire hadn't just crumbled. It had never existed in the first place. "The original trust," Mr. Pemberton said, his professional composure finally cracking. "What remains in it?" I pulled out the final document, a bank statement showing the trust's current balance. $47,036, plus several million in debt to creditors who were never paid for actual work they performed. The number hit the room like a physical force. Someone gasped. Someone else started crying. Marcus's wife buried her face in her hands, probably calculating how many designer handbags she'd have to return to pay for groceries. But I wasn't finished. There was one more revelation that would complete the picture, one final piece of the puzzle that would explain why Grandmother Morrison had chosen me as her successor. Why she'd trusted me with the family legacy when she could have chosen any of the 37 people now staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to admiration to barely contained rage. I reached into the folder one last time, withdrawing a letter written in Grandmother Morrison's distinctive handwriting, dated just 3 days before her death. The envelope was addressed to me, but the contents were meant for this moment, for this room, for this revelation. "She left instructions," I said, unfolding the letter carefully. "She wanted me to read this aloud when the truth finally came out." The letter trembled slightly in my hands, not from nerves but from the weight of what it contained. Grandmother Morrison's handwriting flowed across cream-colored stationery in the elegant script she'd learned in finishing school 70 years earlier. Her words had waited patiently in my safe deposit box for 8 months, growing more powerful with each passing day. "My dearest family," I began, my voice carrying clearly across the silent conference room. "If Tegan is reading this letter, it means the truth has finally emerged about what became of our family's legacy." Dad's breathing grew shallow. Marcus gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles went white. Even the catering staff had stopped moving, frozen in place like actors waiting for their cue in a play nobody had rehearsed. I continued reading, each word deliberate and measured. "For the past 10 years, I watched our family trust being systematically drained by people I loved and trusted. Emergency repairs that never happened, consulting fees paid to ghost companies, investment opportunities that somehow vanished without generating a single dollar of return." Cousin David started to object, but Uncle Robert silenced him with a sharp gesture. The room had transformed into something resembling a courtroom, with me serving as both prosecutor and judge, while 37 defendants waited for their verdicts. "I hired private investigators," the letter continued. "I consulted with forensic accountants. I documented every fraudulent transaction, every forged authorization, every penny stolen from accounts that were meant to benefit the entire family for generations to come." Mr. Pemberton had given up any pretense of professional composure. He sat with his head in his hands, probably calculating how this disaster would affect his law firm's reputation. 40 years of estate planning, and he'd never encountered a family betrayal this sophisticated, this devastating. The letter revealed details that made the earlier documents seem like appetizers before a feast of evidence. Bank routing numbers that traced stolen funds to personal accounts in the Cayman Islands. Property deeds showing vacation homes purchased with trust money and registered under false corporate names. Investment accounts that had been completely liquidated to fund Marcus's gambling debts in Las Vegas. But the theft wasn't just about money, I read, Grandmother Morrison's voice seeming to speak through my own. It was about something far more precious. It was about destroying the values that built this family, the principles of honesty and stewardship that made our success possible in the first place. Aunt Catherine began sobbing openly, mascara streaming down her cheeks in dark rivers. She'd always been Dad's biggest supporter, the sister who defended his decisions even when they seemed questionable. Now she stared at him with the expression of someone who'd just discovered her hero was made of clay. The letter explained why Grandmother Morrison had chosen me as her successor, not because I was perfect, but because I was the only family member who'd never asked her for money. The only one who visited her without an agenda, who listened to her stories without checking my phone, who treated her like a person rather than a walking inheritance. Tegan possesses something the rest of you seem to have forgotten, the letter continued. She understands that wealth is a responsibility, not an entitlement. She knows that power should serve others, not just the person who wields it. The praise felt uncomfortable, even in this moment of vindication. I'd never seen myself as particularly virtuous. I'd simply learned early that asking for things from people who didn't value me was a waste of energy. Better to build my own life, earn my own respect, create my own security. But Grandmother Morrison had been watching more carefully than I realized. She'd noticed how I treated service staff at family gatherings, remembering their names and asking about their families. She'd observed how I handled financial disputes at my job, always seeking solutions that protected the most vulnerable parties. She'd seen qualities in me that I'd never recognized in myself. The new trust. Structure protects our assets from further theft, I read aloud. But more importantly, it ensures that the Morrison legacy will be managed by someone who understands its true purpose. Not to generate wealth for its own sake, but to create opportunities for others, to support causes that matter, to build something lasting and meaningful. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out cracked and desperate. This is insane. You can't just steal an entire family fortune because of some allegations. There are laws, there are procedures, there are courts that will reverse this. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the table. You're absolutely right about courts and procedures, which is why Grandmother Morrison spent 2 years ensuring that every transfer was completely legal, every document filed properly, every signature witnessed and notarized according to state requirements. Dr. Warren stepped forward, opening her own folder. I can provide testimony about Mrs. Morrison's mental state during the planning process. She was lucid, determined, and absolutely certain about her decisions. She even recorded video statements explaining her reasoning, just in case anyone questioned her competency after her death. The video statements. I'd forgotten about those until Dr. Warren mentioned them. Hours of recorded testimony where Grandmother Morrison explained each decision, each transfer, each legal maneuver that had quietly revolutionized the family's financial structure. Her voice clear and steady, her reasoning unshakable, her evidence overwhelming. Dad made one final attempt to salvage his position. Even if the transfers were legal, they can be challenged. Undue influence, coercion. Family members have rights when it comes to inheritance disputes. Actually, said another voice from the doorway, they don't. Everyone turned to see Judge Patricia Hoffman entering the conference room, still wearing her black robes from morning court sessions. She was Grandmother Morrison's longtime friend, the woman who'd officiated her wedding to my grandfather 60 years earlier. More importantly, she was the judge who'd reviewed and approved every aspect of the new trust structure. The Morrison Family Trust was a revocable trust, Judge Hoffman explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades interpreting inheritance law. Mrs. Morrison had absolute discretion to modify its terms, change its beneficiaries, or dissolve it entirely. She exercised that discretion in full accordance with state statutes. She approached the conference table, her presence commanding immediate attention from everyone in the room. I personally reviewed the trust documents. I questioned Mrs. Morrison extensively about her motivations. I satisfied myself that her decisions were voluntary, informed, and legally sound. The judge's involvement wasn't coincidental. Grandmother Morrison had anticipated every possible challenge, every legal avenue that might be used to overturn her decisions. She'd consulted with experts, filed protective motions, and created an evidentiary record that would withstand scrutiny from the most aggressive attorneys. Furthermore, Judge Hoffman continued, the evidence of financial impropriety within the original trust creates legal liability for anyone who participated in or benefited from those transactions. The statute of limitations hasn't expired on several of the larger transfers. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Marcus's face went ashen as the implications sank in. Dad's hands began trembling so violently he had to clasp them together to maintain any semblance of composure. They weren't just losing their inheritance, they were facing potential criminal charges. I reached into my folder one final time, withdrawing a document that would offer them a path forward. a way to salvage some dignity from this catastrophe. Grandmother Morrison wasn't interested in destroying the family, I said, holding up what appeared to be a settlement agreement. She wanted to save it. The agreement outlined terms for avoiding prosecution in exchange for full cooperation with asset recovery efforts. No criminal charges would be filed if stolen funds were returned voluntarily. No public scandal would erupt if the family accepted the new trust structure without challenge. Everyone could walk away with their reputations intact if they chose wisdom over pride. The hotels will continue operating under professional management, I explained, scanning faces that showed mixtures of relief and resentment. Legitimate employees will keep their jobs. Honest vendors will be paid what they're owed. The family name will be preserved. But the days of using Morrison assets as personal piggy banks were finished forever. The era of inheritance based on birth order rather than merit had ended permanently. A new chapter was beginning, one where competence mattered more than connections, where character counted more than charisma. Marcus stared at the settlement papers as if they contained his death warrant. What about me? What about my position with the company? What about my future? Your future, I replied quietly, depends on what you choose to do next. You can fight these revelations and face the consequences. Or you can accept responsibility, make amends, and build something honest with whatever opportunities remain. The choice was theirs. They could rage against the new reality, hire lawyers to challenge the unchallengeable, spend their remaining resources on futile litigation that would only generate more evidence of their wrongdoing. Or they could accept that Grandmother Morrison had outmaneuvered them completely, that justice had arrived wearing the quiet disguise of careful planning and meticulous execution. Ticulous execution. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. 37 pairs of eyes moved between the settlement documents and my face, searching for some sign that this was an elaborate joke, a family prank taken too far. But the legal papers didn't vanish under their stares. The evidence didn't dissolve into wishful thinking. The truth sat there on polished mahogany, solid as granite, and twice as unforgiving. Dad's breathing had turned shallow, each exhale sounding like air escaping from a punctured tire. His face cycled through colors I didn't know human skin could produce, settling finally on a shade somewhere between ash and old newspaper. The man who'd commanded boardrooms with the confidence of Caesar suddenly looked like someone who'd discovered his empire was built on quicksand. "This is impossible," he whispered, but his voice carried no conviction, just the hollow echo of someone speaking words they no longer believed. 40 years I've managed this family's assets. 40 years of building, expanding, growing our legacy. You can't erase that with paperwork tricks. I pulled out another document, this one bearing the seal of the Internal Revenue Service. The paper crinkled like dried leaves as I unfolded it across the table. "The IRS disagrees with your assessment of legacy building. They've been investigating the trust's tax filings for the past 18 months. The federal investigation had been Grandmother Morrison's insurance policy, her final safeguard against anyone who might try to challenge the new arrangements. She'd voluntarily reported the suspicious transactions, providing investigators with detailed records that painted an unmistakable picture of systematic tax evasion disguised as business expenses. Marcus lurched forward, grabbing the IRS document with hands that shook like autumn branches in a windstorm. His eyes scanned the official letterhead, the case numbers, the preliminary findings that outlined years of fraudulent deductions and unreported income. "You reported us to the federal government? Your own family?" "Grandmother Morrison reported the crimes," I corrected, my voice steady as bedrock. "I simply provided the evidence she'd already gathered. The same evidence that led investigators to freeze several offshore accounts registered under shell corporations you thought nobody would discover." The offshore accounts. That revelation hit the room like a physical blow, sending ripples of shock through relatives who'd thought they understood the scope of the deception. Aunt Catherine's champagne glass slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the marble floor with a sound sharp enough to make everyone flinch. Offshore accounts? Uncle Robert's voice cracked like a teenager asking his first date to prom. Marcus, tell me that's not true. Tell me you didn't hide family money in foreign banks. Marcus opened his mouth, but no words emerged. His throat worked silently, like a fish gasping for water, while his wife buried her face in designer handbags that suddenly seemed obscenely expensive. The Hermès purse, the Louboutin shoes, the Cartier watch that caught conference room lights like a beacon announcing stolen wealth. I reached into my folder again, producing bank statements from institutions in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Luxembourg, account numbers that matched wire transfer records, deposit dates that coincided with mysterious disappearances from the original trust, a paper trail so clear that even someone without forensic accounting training could follow its devastating logic. The money didn't just vanish, I explained, spreading the international banking documents across the table like cards in a losing hand. It was systematically moved to jurisdictions that don't cooperate with American tax authorities. At least, they didn't cooperate until Grandmother Morrison provided federal investigators with account numbers, routing information, and access codes. The access codes. Marcus had been careless with his digital security, using the same passwords across multiple platforms, storing sensitive information in email accounts that Grandmother Morrison's private investigators had quietly monitored for months. Every transaction documented, every transfer recorded, every attempt at financial concealment preserved in digital amber. Dr. Warren stepped forward again, consulting notes written in her precise medical handwriting. Mrs. Morrison's final months were spent ensuring that every piece of evidence was properly documented and legally admissible. She understood that family loyalty has limits, that protecting stolen wealth wasn't love but enabling. The doctor's words carried the weight of someone who'd watched a brilliant woman systematically dismantle a criminal enterprise operated by people she'd raised from childhood. Grandmother Morrison hadn't acted from spite or revenge. She'd acted from the same sense of justice that had driven her to build the family fortune through honest work and careful investment. Judge Hoffman moved closer to the conference table, her black robes rustling like raven wings in the sudden quiet. The criminal referral has already been filed with the U.S. Attorney's Office. They're reviewing the case for potential charges, including tax evasion, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. The federal charges hung over the room like storm clouds heavy with rain. Money laundering. The words transformed Marcus from successful businessman to potential federal prisoner, from family golden boy to defendant in a case that would make headlines across the Southwest hospitality industry. Dad's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. How much time do we have before arrests? That depends, Judge Hoffman replied, her tone carrying the measured authority of someone who'd sentenced countless defendants over 3 decades on the bench. The prosecutor's office is willing to consider plea agreements for full cooperation and complete asset recovery. Complete asset recovery. The phrase meant confessing to everything, returning every stolen dollar, accepting whatever consequences emerged from a decade of systematic theft. It meant acknowledging that the Morrison legacy they'd claimed to protect had actually been gutted from within by the very people entrusted with its preservation. I pulled out the final document, a comprehensive restitution agreement that outlined exactly how much money needed to be returned and by what deadline. The numbers were staggering, even by the standards of people accustomed to thinking in millions rather than thousands. $18.7 million, I announced, watching faces pale as the figure sank in. That's the amount investigators determined was diverted from legitimate trust purposes over the past decade. $18.7 million. More than most people would see in multiple lifetimes. More than the GDP of small countries. More than anyone in that room could possibly repay, even if they liquidated every asset they owned. The number represented years of luxury vacations disguised as business trips, phantom consulting fees, emergency repairs that somehow required 7-figure budgets. Marcus's wife began crying softly, tears streaming down cheeks that had never known financial hardship. Her entire adult life had been funded by money that didn't belong to her, supported by wealth built on deception and systematic theft. The designer lifestyle, the exclusive social circles, the charitable donations that bought social standing, all of it purchased with stolen funds. "The houses," she whispered between sobs, "the cars, the jewelry, the children's private schools, everything we own came from the trust accounts. Everything they owned would have to be sold to begin satisfying the restitution requirements. The Malibu beach house, the Park City ski lodge, the collection of vintage automobiles that Marcus displayed like trophies in his custom garage. Assets accumulated through years of theft would be liquidated to repay the victims of that same theft. But the financial consequences were only the beginning. The Morrison name, carefully cultivated through decades of community involvement and charitable giving, would be forever associated with federal crimes and family betrayal. Hotel industry publications would cover the scandal. Business schools would study the case as an example of corporate governance failure. Mr. Pemberton finally found his voice, though it emerged strained and uncertain. "The settlement agreement offers some protection from public disclosure. If restitution is made voluntarily and completely, the prosecutor has agreed to pursue charges under seal." Charges under seal. A legal mechanism that would keep the criminal proceedings confidential, protecting the family name from complete destruction while still ensuring that justice was served. It was more mercy than Marcus and Dad deserved, more consideration than they'd shown when stealing from accounts meant to benefit the entire family. The choice before them was stark and unforgiving. Accept complete responsibility, return every stolen dollar, and face whatever criminal penalties emerged from their decade of systematic theft. Or fight the charges, endure a public trial that would destroy what remained of their reputations, and ultimately face the same financial ruin plus additional penalties for refusing to cooperate. I watched 37 family members process this impossible decision, their faces showing the full spectrum of human emotion: shock, anger, disbelief, acceptance, resignation. The conference room had become a courtroom where verdicts were being rendered not by judges and juries, but by the simple weight of documented truth. Cousin Jennifer raised a trembling hand like a student asking permission to speak. "What happens to the rest of us, the people who didn't know about the stealing?" It was a fair question, one that Grandmother Morrison had anticipated during her careful planning. The innocent family members, the relatives who'd trusted Dad and Marcus without questioning their methods, deserved protection from consequences they hadn't earned through their own actions. "The new trust structure includes provisions for legitimate family members," I explained, consulting notes written in Grandmother Morrison's distinctive handwriting. "Educational assistance, emergency medical support, reasonable assistance during genuine hardship, but no more automatic distributions, no more treating family money like personal allowances. The assistance would be merit-based, need-based, and carefully monitored to prevent future abuse. Cousin David's daughter would still receive help with college tuition, but only if she maintained academic standards and chose practical career paths. Uncle Robert would still get support for his heart medication, but only through direct payments to medical providers rather than cash distributions. The era of blank checks signed with other people's money had ended permanently. The time when family connection guaranteed financial support without accountability or oversight was finished forever. A new chapter was beginning, one where help would be earned rather than inherited, where trust would be rebuilt through actions rather than assumed through bloodlines. Dad stared at the restitution agreement with eyes that seemed to see through the paper to some distant horizon where his old life was disappearing like smoke. 40 years, he said again. But this time the words carried no defiance, just the hollow echo of someone calculating what remained after everything meaningful had been stripped away. 40 years of building a reputation that would be destroyed in a single news cycle. 40 years of accumulating assets that would be liquidated to pay restitution. 40 years of commanding respect that would evaporate the moment federal charges became public knowledge. The Morrison family legacy would survive, but not in the form anyone had expected. It would continue under new management, guided by different principles, serving purposes that extended beyond personal enrichment. The hotels would still operate, the properties would still generate income, but the wealth would serve broader goals than funding luxury lifestyles for people who'd never earned their positions. Marcus signed the settlement agreement with a hand that trembled like leaves in a hurricane. His signature looked shaky, uncertain, nothing like the bold flourishes he'd used when authorizing transfers from accounts that hadn't belonged to him. Each letter seemed to cost him something, each stroke of the pen acknowledging another piece of his former life that would never return. Dad's signature followed, smaller than usual, cramped and defensive. The man who'd commanded respect through volume and authority now wrote his name like someone afraid of taking up too much space on the page. His empire hadn't just collapsed, it had been revealed as an illusion, an elaborate performance built on foundations that had never existed. As the last signature dried on the settlement papers, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph or vindication, but a deep sadness for the family that might have been. The relationships that could have existed if honesty had been valued more than hierarchy, if character had mattered more than charisma, if love had been expressed through respect rather than financial control. But sadness wouldn't change what had happened, and regret wouldn't restore trust that had been systematically destroyed through years of deception. The only path forward led through accountability, through consequences, through the slow process of rebuilding something honest from the ruins of what had been lost. The conference room began to empty as family members filed out in stunned silence, their celebratory afternoon transformed into something resembling a wake for dreams that would never be realized. The catering staff quietly cleared champagne glasses that would never be raised in toast, removed silver trays that would never serve celebration meals. Mr. Pemberton packed his briefcase with movements that seemed older, more careful, as if the afternoon had aged him beyond his years. 40 years of estate planning, and he'd never encountered a family betrayal this complete, this devastating, this thoroughly documented. Judge Hoffman approached me as the room cleared, her expression mixing professional respect with personal admiration. "Your grandmother would be proud," she said quietly, "not just of what you accomplished today, but of who you've become. She saw something in you that others missed." Something others missed. The phrase captured everything about growing up as the overlooked daughter, the family member whose worth was measured differently, whose contributions were valued less, whose potential was consistently underestimated by people who should have known better. But Grandmother Morrison had seen clearly when others looked through clouded lenses of favoritism and assumption. She'd recognized qualities that mattered more than charm or confidence, traits that would prove more valuable than the ability to command attention in crowded rooms. As the last family member departed, I remained alone in the conference room with documents that had changed everything, papers that represented not just financial transfers, but a complete revolution in family power dynamics. The Morrison legacy would continue, but under completely different terms, guided by completely different values. The quiet satisfaction I felt wasn't about winning or losing, wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about justice served through patience and preparation, about truth emerging despite years of careful concealment, about competence finally receiving recognition after decades of being overlooked. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to prove that Grandmother Morrison's faith had been well placed. The hotels needed honest management, the properties required careful stewardship, the family needed healing that could only come through accountability and genuine change. But tonight, in a conference room where champagne glasses had been raised to celebrate theft and deception, justice had finally found its voice. Truth had finally emerged from shadows, where it had waited patiently for someone brave enough to bring it into the light, brave enough to bring it into the light. The late afternoon sun slanted through conference room windows, casting long shadows across documents that had rewritten an entire family's destiny. I gathered the papers slowly, each one a testament to the power of patience over impulse, preparation over assumption, quiet competence over loud entitlement. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with fanfare or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it comes through careful documentation, methodical investigation, and the wisdom of an elderly woman who understood that protecting a legacy means more than preserving wealth. It means ensuring that wealth serves worthy purposes in capable hands. The Morrison family would heal, eventually. Trust would be rebuilt through actions rather than words. The hotels would thrive under honest management. But the days of inheritance based on birth order rather than character, of power distributed through favoritism rather than merit, those days were finished forever. If you've ever been the overlooked one, the family member whose worth was consistently underestimated, remember this: your quiet competence has value. Your careful observations matter. Your patient preparation may be exactly what's needed when truth finally demands its moment in the light. The champagne glasses had been cleared away, but the taste of justice lingered. Sweet, satisfying, and earned through years of watching, learning, and waiting for the right moment to ensure that what was stolen could finally be returned to where it belonged. Some battles are won not through force, but through the simple power of being right when everyone else chooses to be wrong. Today was one of those victories.